It's a special privilege to be back in Buffalo. I spent time in the mid-'70s here when I was a younger human, working on some federal grant projects that were concerned about consumer participation in healthcare delivery. And I worked with some family planning programs in the Finger Lakes area, and I always came to Buffalo. And for reasons that I'm still not sure, the 4 times that I came to Buffalo, I came in the winter. And coming from Houston to Buffalo in the winter is a bit of a transition. And I never brought enough clothing with me. And it was always one of those especially cold, damp days. But I do remember there was this really cool Hungarian restaurant that I'm sure isn't here any longer, downtown, and somebody was playing the violin, and it was very small. And you remember that? Does anybody know about that? This was back in the mid-'70s, late '70s. I couldn't remember if I had to. I have enough trouble remembering my own name. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you, and that's what I'm hoping that we can do. So don't hesitate during our discussion to interrupt me, to throw something at me, to ask a question, and I hope we'll have enough time that we can do some stuff interactively. Catherine asked me in part to speak about things associated with the Schiavo case, but to expand if I wanted to, and I take the liberty of kind of talking about whatever I want to most of the time. So we're going to talk today about manufacturing chairs. Well, let me start off with a. Can you all see that? Can you all see that in the back of the room? This was one of 2 pages in the centerpiece, the centerfold of a magazine, a very high-end magazine, I might add, that was published, still is published in Florida, but this came out some years ago, and it was an advertisement. And it had a clear purpose, and from what I have since understood, the people who put this together spent $250,000 to send you this message. What's your name, sir?
Yeah.
What's your name?
Yeah.
Yeah?
No.
No. Okay.
Thank you.
Does this?
Yeah.
This is a message for you. It's the first page. What does it say to you? What do you see? What does it tell you? What does it help you understand?
How busy things are.
But what's the title?
Healthcare.
Healthcare. What about healthcare, and what are those things?
Bees.
And what about it?
I'm not sure.
Well, worker bees. But are all bees worker bees? No, there's a queen. You never hear about the king bee, do you? Talk about a maternal society. So people look at this and they have all kinds of impressions as to what this might mean. So what? Anything jumping out at you other than bee? Busy. What's the thing about bees, though? Are bees just randomly busy? They're dangerous. Ooh. Do you have a thing about bees?
Yeah.
But bees they're busy, but they're purposeful. They're highly organized. They're specialized, aren't they? So if you're talking about the healthcare system, and you want to say something about it that's, that's nice. You say the healthcare system is comprised of these highly specialized components, and they're well trained. But you notice that there's a certain disorganization to them, and we're not sure whether this is the queen or not. But this one's kind of wandering off. So this is the first part of the message, and on the second page, which is facing it, is the second part. Now, this is brought to you by the good old folks at Humana Healthcare. This is when Bill Frist still owned it. Now that you had both pieces of the message, what are you being told for $250,000?
Well, that the managed care is the result of the work of the bees, and that's a good thing.
Good man. Oh, he's got it. And therefore, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
It captures the essence of all that specialized, sometimes random, uncontrolled, hard work brings it all together into one nice place. But look carefully at the image. Anything else? The label? Oh, there's no label. Well, it's because it's the essence. It doesn't need a label. It's pure. The label's on the bottom, obviously. There's anything else about that image?
It's cloudy. It's foggy.
Well, do you want clear honey? There's translucent honey. I don't know if there's transparent honey. Could be. I'm not a honey guy. I'm not the beekeeper. Anything else about this, about the image that... Pure? Oh. It's pure. It's the essence. It's the good stuff. Nothing else grabbing you about this image?
Contained.
It's contained. Good. That means it's controlled. What about the cap?
Tight.
What does that mean?
Tight. Well, I'm not giving any away.
Well then. One of the questions that often comes up when I use this prop is, how do you get in? We're not worried about the honey getting out. We're worried about how do you get into it. And there's a cap on it, and it's screwed. So that created some concerns among some consumer groups. But the coolest response I had was when I presented this to a group of Gray Panthers, to which I will soon become a member. And these are the how should we classify the Gray Panther group? These are senior citizens. I'm older than you are. Give me a break. These are folks 60, 70, 80 who are very active politically in our communities. Very active. And I had a group of these folks, and they were, there were about 100 of them in a room, and they were really active. And we were talking about healthcare reform, and I showed this, and there was this little lady. She must have been 3'6" in the back of the room, and she raised her hand and she said, "It looks like a jar of urine." Now that you think of it, doesn't it? This was only displayed once. It was never used again, and I think it's because they received similar feedback about the product. There's a great deal of concern for what this means, but the message that we send out, that we think we're sending out, is not always the message that's received. It's a miracle to me that we're able to build roads and bridges and buildings and think that we're training physicians and social workers, attorneys, psychologists, pharmacists, and we send them out, and we assume that they're going to be doing what we think we're training them, educating them to do, and then we go home and we realize that we can't even communicate very effectively with our own spouses and kids. And we wonder why. Well, the answer is because it's your fault. Take responsibility. The challenge, the extraordinary thing is that it works. These buildings aren't collapsing on us. That engineers build things. That we eat foods that aren't poisoning us constantly. That I can open up a bottle of water and drink it. Let me get to this thing, because this was in the original title. When Catherine said, "Okay, if you're going to talk, we need a title. Give us a title." So I was struggling with the title, and I talk about Nietzsche a lot, and you'll see why in a minute. And I do a lot of work around training of professionals, and I threw this thing in called the Goldilocks Effect. The Goldilocks Effect. Do you know what the Goldilocks Effect is?
No, we were wondering about that.
Were you really?
Yeah, we were. We were talking.
Well, good. We can work on this together. It's a group project. Well, let's remember now, even regardless of your age, because you're clearly the youngest person in the room.
I always am.
I used to be able to say that until a few weeks ago. And then suddenly, look what happened to me. I turned into a near-old fart. Okay? It'll happen to you too, don't worry. In the meantime, you're old enough to remember the story of Goldilocks? What about Goldilocks, do you think? What happened to Goldilocks?
I can't remember. She got lost?
She got lost, and she went to the three... Yes! I knew you knew it.
Bears.
She goes into the three bears, and then what happens?
They were sleeping in her bed.
They were sleeping in her beds? How many?
In their bed?
They ate something? She did 3 things, okay? She walks in and she's hungry. But she didn't just eat the porridge. All 3 of them. But one of them was, the other one was, yes. Now we got him, right? Okay. And then she decides to sit down in a chair. And one of them is, the other one is, and the third one is just right. And finally, she's tired after doing all these things, and she decides to go into one of their beds, and the same thing happens. One is too hard, one's too soft, and the third one is just right. So what does this have to do with anything I might speak with you about? Well, it has to do with the expectations we have, particularly as they relate to the training of our students and the education of our students to become professionals. Professional attorneys, professional physicians, professional social workers, professional psychologists, professional therapists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, professional pharmacists. And what I've noticed, and the discussions I've had with your good colleagues since last night and this morning, is that there's a consensus. And the consensus is that there's been a shift of sorts. And it's not new, because some of this stuff has been discussed for a while. Any of you ever read any of Kurt Vonnegut's stuff? Christopher Lasch? Vonnegut talks about, in one of his science fiction novels, about a society in which expectations have to be diminished substantially, where mediocrity becomes the norm. And as a consequence, we lower the bar and lower the bar and lower the bar. And if you should, for example, have an interest in being a public speaker or a radio announcer, and you did not have a profound speech impediment, you would have to put things in your mouth. If you were interested in becoming an athlete and you did not have a severe physical disability, you would have to put chains on your legs so that you could not perform to your potential because the standard was being reduced. Christopher Lasch talks about a society in which our expectations diminish as a consequence of the overwhelming things that are affecting us. We can't ingest, digest things sufficiently, so we simply lower our expectations further and further. And in the process, I suggest to you that our standards that we measure our expectations against in terms of performance have a schizophrenic component. And that is the entitlement phenomenon that afflicts all of our societal members causes many people we work with to have lower expectations of what's expected of them. Accreditation requirements for all of our professional programs encourage us, demand that we put more technical requirements in place, checklists, guidelines, so that we meet those things, and we kind of forget about why we're doing this. But in order to get accredited, in order to meet the guidelines, in order to avoid liability, we become technicians, or the trainers of technicians. And in the process, we shift those expectations so that the just right of yesterday is different from the just right of a week before and of what the just right tomorrow is going to be like. That becomes the Goldilocks effect. It's a bit of an extrapolation of Lasch and Vonnegut. So I take no credit for it. And I don't know who wrote Goldilocks. So this part of it, the standards and the missions of our efforts being transformed, is something that I've seen and felt and worked with in professional education, graduate education, and research for the past 30 years. And I was intrigued by some of Catherine's research, which has indicated for some time that the expectations of social work students coming into the system have undergone a profound transformation. That's in many ways conflicting with the values and mission of social work training and education. So that 60%, some odd, 60%, maybe more, of those respondents say that they're going into social work to provide clinical services to people. They want to become clinicians. rather than address underserved populations and affect social equality. That varies substantially from the mission of social work. But we're seeing the same thing in medicine and law. And I have to remind my students at the beginning of the semester and at the end of the semester and as they're graduating, they are not TV repair technicians. It's very easy to train surgeons to cut. But how do we deal with that other part of it, Tom, that we were speaking about last night, the empathy? The ability to connect. And do we just want to put people out there who have the technical skills? Because if we're doing that, all we're doing is feeding into a future system that will eliminate the need for us in the first place. We can program the system. In fact, what we said was, if somebody, you've got a lot of bright people coming into the discipline, but maybe they lack that empathic capability. That empathic switch has been turned off, or maybe it wasn't there. So we were talking about it last night, and Tom said what they'll do is they'll compensate by learning the cues. So we can teach them the cues so that they can watch and they can figure out exactly how you're behaving, and they can learn their cues from that and take it and perform properly, or at least adequately. They may not even know why, but they're following the technical protocol as long as we can continue to feed them with the proper cues, which is what we do in research. So that's the Goldilocks thing, in case you were wondering. So was I. We talked about Vonnegut. We've talked about Lash. The technocracy is in a formula-driven professionalization process, which is what I just alluded to. And I think we have to ask these questions. As we bow to those, out of necessity, in part, because we don't have time to stand back and say, enough of this shit. Oh, my. Imagine saying that in a faculty meeting. Tom, would you say something like that in a faculty meeting? Would you not? Would you not say something like that in a faculty meeting? Okay? This process, this environment, the effects that it has on what we have to teach in terms of accreditation, I've got my medical school curriculum, which is so lockstepped. And it's the same way in law, it's the same way in pharmacy and nursing, I suspect it's the same way in social work and psychology, that if it ain't on the boards, we don't necessarily include it as part of the classwork. And if we do, it's kind of superficial, it's on the margins. And then on the people we attract, going back to Catherine's research, their motivations and expectations, coming into social work, coming into law, coming into medicine, and the effects and the processes and the outcomes. And here I'll have to get personal for a moment. My eldest son is finishing his 4th year of medical school. And he has been struggling through the process because it drives him nuts. He goes into lectures and goes into grand rounds where he is bombarded with drug therapies. In fact, in most cases, the process will start off with, today we're going to talk about this drug and how we can use it for all these cool diseases. Because that's what we do. And he'll raise his hand and he'll say, that's very interesting, but can we talk about diet and exercise and other behavioral things? Good question, Alan. Use this drug. Now, before Alan went to medical school, he was concerned about the extent to which that structured socialization process would break him. That it would excise his enthusiasm. That it would substantially diminish his intuitive capabilities. And that it would cause him to become just another technocrat. I suggested to him early on that throughout his pre-medical school education, he'd been taking dives in the pool because he'd focus on chemistry, focus on biochemistry. He'd have to do those things, and he'd come up for air once in a while. Because pre-medical school education is very demanding. All education should be demanding but interesting. And I said, now you're going to be doing more than just jumping in the pool and coming up for air. You're going to have to swim the length of the pool. Because there's going to be a lot of stuff in this process that you will find offensive. That you really won't like. But remember the experience of Picasso. I've got some old books about Picasso, and early on, I've got his pottery. I don't have his pottery. I have pictures of his pottery and pictures of his old drawings. He did very traditional stuff. He learned the traditional way of doing things, and then he went out and did his thing. I said, you have to get your ticket punched. How often do we say that? You got to get your ticket punched, and then you can do your thing. In the meantime, prescribe this. In the meantime, this is what we do. In the meantime, learn this and know this, and at least say that you do this. Because we have to say that for accreditation purposes. I have to put a stamp on you that says that you fulfilled the requirements for the medical doctorate degree at the University of South Florida, and that I trained you properly. So I keep on telling Alan every once in a while, which is usually once a week. It's been that way for the past 3.5 years of medical school. Keep swimming underwater, hold your breath. You're almost at the end of the pool. Then you get up at the end of that pool and you go into your residency. And you take a deep breath and you do it again. Now we have to do that all our lives in some cases. We either have to hold our breath or hold our tongue. And we have to get to the end of the pool in order to get where we think or we know we need to go. And as long as we retain our emotional and intellectual integrity, we can do that. The risk is if we get up in the middle of the pool, I've had enough of this, I'm not going to do it. And some people have done that with success and done something else. But if you really believe that the academic course that you're on, the discipline that you have chosen, has value in terms of transforming not just yourself, but the world that your children, your grandchildren, and your friends are going to live in, it can be very selfish. I'm the most selfish person you will ever meet. I'm the most egocentric, self-centered, narcissistic, instant gratification creature you will know. I am the representative of my generation. You don't have to do a survey. Just ask me. But selfishness is good. And if we weren't selfish, we'd eat ourselves, let alone each other. But it goes in increments. There are gradations. And no one is completely giving. Even Mother Teresa may have had some moments where she was selfish. We talked about this. The social, political, clinical, legal standards. And our production functions at the academy. Recruiting and training these people to do these things. Alan Watts. Remember him? Kind of a crazy British Buddhist dude. Grew up in his Episcopal and then abandoned all that stuff and spent some time on the sides of mountains, made some cool tapes. Alan Watts says that we all run the risk, if we're being intellectually and emotionally honest, of having an unorthodox and heretical consciousness. Oh dear, I'm thinking about something that I shouldn't. I'm thinking about something that may offend you. I'm doing something that may offend you. We all have our private madnesses now, don't we? The things that we think about and do that we really don't want others to know about. The unorthodox and heretical consciousness. I go back to my son Alan again. He's in a hospital rotation, and Alan is very conscious about good science, and they tell him that he has to wear a tie when he's in the emergency room. And he said, excuse me, but the literature is pretty good on this. You know, ties just, they carry bacteria, infections, you know, it's probably, you know, they said, you're absolutely right, Alan, wear a tie. He went nuts. I said, wear a bow tie. Voila. Watts also had a great line that everyone fits into some DSM category. Life is a disease with a poor prognosis. So among the challenges we face is if we're looking for something to classify things into, and we have our toolbox, and we think that it's the toolbox, then we've got our hammer and everything we see is a nail. And we train our students, we educate our students, and we reinforce among ourselves that this is the way. Don't bother thinking about it. You don't need to. We've got you covered. We've given you the tools. And it's the tools that will give you the solution. Not your intuitive capacity, your reasoning, your questioning. You're asking, yeah, but what about? Good question, Alan. Wear a tie. Now, Christopher Lasch referenced George Orwell in his famous book, The Culture of Narcissism, written back in the 1970s. You can read it today and you see it's happening now. But George Orwell predated all of that by a few years. Sign of trouble when things can no longer be called by their right names and described in plain, forthright speech, when we have to find other ways of describing things because they might be offensive, or we're going to classify them as something and make you believe that this is yellow, right?
Yeah, sure.
See? It works. And why didn't you say, no, it's not, it's white? Maybe it is, because maybe it is yellow and you don't know it yet.
Could be colorblind.
There you go. Maybe you are. In which case I would have offended you. In the academy, as in private industry, since 9/11, since Virginia Tech, and since 2 days ago at the University of Texas, my alma mater, there have been transformations of an earth-shattering nature that have affected the way we do business. And some of it's disturbing to me, but maybe I'm just me. What my colleagues and I have seen is that there is an increased concern within the academy about its responsibilities. Translate that into liabilities. To identify and mitigate risks. And that's reasonable. We want to have risk management. Risk management is a good thing. We want to be able to identify potential adverse events and create system controls around it. That's what patient safety is all about. But part of that process goes back to the way we solve problems now. And that is developing templates and paradigms as screening tools. Well, that's good too. We want to have triaging. The system's very complex. We've got lots of things. We need to have some signs that we can use as a basis for telling people to go left and right, up and down. You go here. Do it as an outpatient, not an inpatient. But because of what happened in those events, we've developed a special interest in issues of substance abuse that could be related to bad behaviors, uncontrolled behaviors, depression, suicide, chronic disease management. That seems like a weird continuum. You know, going from identifying people who meet the template of the 9/11 terrorists, or the Virginia Tech shootist, or the University of Texas shootist, and saying, let's look at the variables that were associated with their character. What were their ages, their sexes, their sociodynamics? What kinds of behaviors did they wrote interesting, perhaps strange things in their English classes? Does that alone make for a risk factor? Well, he did. Therefore, we want to look out for people who do those things. The danger here is something called the black swan effect. And we have done it historically and consistently in this country. When there is an adverse event, we study the components very carefully that are associated with it. We identify those variables, and then we shift all of our resources toward that. But the likelihood of a repeat event that's associated with those variables is usually minuscule. Meantime, all this other stuff is going on. But in the process, we do some very disturbing things that are happening at my institution and at other institutions across the country. And those include not just concerning ourselves with substance abuse policies on campus. I chaired our alcohol abuse and substance abuse policy committee at the university, and it was a trip. But we begin to say, what are the correlates of behaviors about which we are concerned? Well, depression, and then the word, gosh, committing suicide. It would be horrible if we have students committing suicide or faculty committing suicide. So we want to be able to identify people who might fit certain profiles and help them in advance, risk manage them, to the point where we're now instructing faculty members, students, staff, if you see students who display these behaviors in the classroom or in their dorms, call us, and we'll intervene. It got to the point last year where 2 young ladies were thought to be anorexic. The counseling center got called, the vice president of Student Services organized resources, and counselors were sent to the dormitories to help this young lady, with everybody around knowing what was going on. Parents went nuts. Now, they were minors, by the way. But still, at what point do we intervene in the life of somebody? I'm so concerned about you that I want to intervene in your health because you're part of this family at the university. Now, that can be a good thing. But think of the implications. Think of the ramifications. Now, the disease management part is kind of interesting because we're doing a bunch of stuff with technology. People in our society will give up nearly everything in their lives except this. Homeless folks will have little, but they'll have a phone. Which is why in some of the NIH-funded stuff that I'm working on, we're able to use telephones for communicating with homeless people about disease issues, about follow-up appointments. It's the last thing they're going to give. It's their last tentacle in contact with the rest of the galaxy. They'll give up television, but they'll keep this. They can watch television on this. And this serves as the platform for so much that's going to be happening. And it's really kind of cool. Let me take one example, diabetes. Currently, if you're a type 1 diabetic and you wear an infusion pump, it's telling you what? It's telling you how much you're infusing into your system, but you still have to pump yourself with a pin several times a day to see what your blood glucose level is. And then based on what it is, you either press the button or it automatically, several times a day, based on your programming, releases insulin. But what if you could put a second lead on there? And since it's intradermal already, the lead has the capacity to pick up trace blood, put it through an analysis here, transmit it to a computer, do an A1C analysis automatically, and automatically determine. You no longer have to prick your finger. It's wonderful. Imagine that. The technology is there. It hasn't been done. It has some complications that we're working on with Motorola and some other companies. But it's going to happen, right? You know why it's going to happen? It's going to happen because I thought of it, just as we discussed at lunch. If you can think about it, it happens. You make it so. It's always dangerous. Okay, so we're going to go further than that because we want people to have a life that's free of the worries, the concerns, the fears, the anxieties associated with chronic disease management, for those of you who know people or who yourself deal with such things. Imagine if we could do that, and if we could take it a step further. We hook it into your primary care physician, your specialist. We feed back information to you. When things go a little bit awry, we can send a message to your family members. We're talking about taking some of our students and being able to do that with them so that their parents can know more about their diabetes status while they're away from home for the first time, to give them a sense of comfort. And theoretically, we could do it with any metabolic disease, for which there is a blood level basis for monitoring. You can do Parkinson's, schizophrenia, and as soon as your meds get a little bit weird, it automatically injects. Or it connects with the computer, and the computer automatically injects for you. This is a wonderful thing. It's the next stage in disease management. Now, there's another part of this as well, and that is I now have access to all your information. Of course, I have that anyway, I just haven't told you yet. But you know it. You know that I've been watching you for years. Every time you buy something at the store, you think they ask you for your little card because they want to give you a discount. They want to know what you've been buying. And they correlate that with your zip code and everything else, so they can develop marketing strategies and all kinds of other cool things. We know all about you. We want to know more about you so that we can care for you. But also, when I developed at full capacity, when I am caring for your Parkinson's disease and your diabetes and your schizophrenia, if you're lucky enough to have all of them at one time, and any other metabolic dysfunction that I could manage for you, I'm taking that worry away from you. I can also turn you off if you misbehave. Because it's compliance that I'm concerned about, isn't it? We want our patients, our clients, to be compliant. Compliance is good. But compliance with what? With whose standards? With whose expectations? These are wonderful things, and I love them. And I'm a Mac freak, always have been. But let's go into this next era with our eyes wide open and make sure we have no misunderstandings. We've talked about this. And there is a rush to know. I'm involved in Florida and throughout the nation in information system development around health systems. Electronic health records, electronic medical records, regional health information organizations, RIOs, RINs, regional health information networks, which take these RIOs and put them together and share information between and among providers with interoperable systems that allow hospitals, physicians, clinics, ambulatory surgical facilities, pharmacies, patients and their families to share information so that we can better provide care and services, establish meaningful benchmarks for outcome, improve safety, reduce the scribbles of written pharmaceutical prescriptions, health information exchanges. And we've got to rush. There's a huge push. The new healthcare reform legislation puts billions of dollars into communities to get electronic health record systems into physicians' offices, to link those record systems to information exchanges in their communities that RIOs will manage, share with RINs, and make available information that will make us all healthier, happier, and better. Yes? Are these good ideas? Some of you may have heard this or seen this already, but here's some food for thought.
Pizza Palace, guaranteed hot in 30 minutes or it's free. This is Mary. May I take your order?
Hi, Mary. Yes, I'd like to order.
Is this Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Thank you for calling again, sir. I share your national identification number as 610-204-9998-45-54610. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I see you live at 736 Montrose Court, but you're calling from your cell phone. Are you at home?
I'm just leaving work, but I'm...
Oh, we can deliver to Bob's Auto Supply. That's at 175 Lincoln Avenue, yes?
No, I'm on my way home. How do you know all this stuff?
We just got wired into the system, sir.
Oh, well, I'd like to order a couple of your double meat special pizzas.
Sure thing. There'll be a new $20 charge for this, sir.
What do you mean?
Sir, the system shows me that your medical records indicate that you have high blood pressure and extremely high cholesterol. Luckily, we have a new agreement with your national health care provider that allows us to sell you double meat pies as long as you agree to waive all future claims of liability.
What?
Do you agree, sir? You can sign the form when we deliver, but there is a charge for processing. The total is $67 even.
$67?
That includes the delivery surcharge of $15 to cover the added risk to our driver of traveling through an orange zone.
I live in an orange zone?
Now you do. Looks like there was another robbery on Montrose yesterday. You could save $48 if you ordered our special sprout submarine combo and picked it up yourself. Comes with tofu sticks. Those are very tasty, sir. Good value, too.
But I want double meat.
Well, I'm sure you can afford the $67 then. You just bought those tickets to Hawaii. They weren't cheap. But I think you checked out the budget beach bum at the library last week. Up to you, sir.
Right. I'll get the sprout subs.
Good choice, sir. Gotta watch that waist if you're hitting the beach, eh? 42 inches. Wow. Man, I'd say tofu and sprouts is like required.
That's how much?
Just between you and me, there's a $3 off coupon in this month's Total Men's Fitness magazine. Your wife Betty subscribes to that, right? Anyhow, clip that and it's $19.99 even. Whoa, looks like you maxed out on all your credit cards. Bring cash, okay?
Want to stop this from happening?
Okay. Watching you. We've been watching you for a long time. This is nothing new. And it shouldn't be a surprise nor unexpected. Are you comfortable with this? Obviously you are. Thank you. Good. You comfortable with this?
Not this pizza place.
What difference does it make who it is? I already have access to this information. All of these data are roaming out there in the ether. And it's by design, it's by intent. The train left the station a long time ago. The availability of information about you, about us, is a given. We presume it. Sit back. Just relax. We'll take care of it. Trust us. Trust me. You don't trust me? Do you not trust me? Is that a problem? Have I done something to disengender your trust, other than speaking the truth? So you do trust me.
Tell him, Joe.
Well, proven otherwise.
Until proven otherwise. By that time, you won't know. Remember, all of this is her dream. You know what I'm talking about? Yes? All of this is just the tip of the iceberg, is what it is. It's only just begun, even though much of it has already happened. It's just a matter of your awareness. My attorneys who are being trained in my law school. This is what, I'm sure you have nothing like this in Buffalo. No. That the sides of your buses, your phone books, large posters don't advertise legal services. How much is my case worth? We have beautiful posters that say something adverse happened to you. It can't be your fault because you're not capable of having responsibility for it. You gave that up long ago. Therefore, it's got to be somebody else's fault. Let's sue. Some of you may remember a few years ago, there erupted in the news an event that took on ridiculously catastrophic and cataclysmic proportions. Decisions about the end of life of one Theresa Schiavo, a young woman in Florida. And I don't watch television, if you can imagine that. And I don't read local newspapers. So I really had no clue about any of this. I'd heard about some family feud, the sidebars of the legal literature, but didn't pay attention. And one day I get a call from the governor's office asking me if I would be interested in serving as the guardian ad litem for Theresa Schiavo, Terry Schiavo. And I wasn't sure what that was about, to be quite candid. I'm really a pretty naive guy. But there was a law passed in Florida. Ms. Schiavo's family had been disputing for some years about whether or not a hydration and feeding tube that had been attached to her should be removed. She had been diagnosed several times as being in a persistent vegetative state. And after a period of time, her then husband, Michael, made a decision to remove the tube. The family, her parents, challenged that decision. They lost the first time, the tube was removed, and then it was reinserted following a court order. That happened again a second time, some years later, as the litigation took up steam. Court order to remove it was removed, and then another court order to reinsert it because of uncertainty. By this time, the press kind of got a hold of it because the politicians got a hold of it. It became a cause célèbre on both sides of the political spectrum. At the third calling, it had gone up to the United States Supreme Court and down twice. It had been to our state Supreme Court about 4 times, and each time the decision was affirmed. Judge George Greer, who was the judge in the trial, had reluctantly and dispassionately ruled that the husband had the right to remove the nutrition and feeding tube and hydration tube, and that she was, in fact, in a persistent vegetative state, according to all the evidence. The Florida legislature, with the encouragement of then-Governor Jeb Bush, intervened and passed an extraordinary law, which became known as Terris Law, that had two requirements, two elements. It said that the governor, Jeb Bush, had the prerogative of reinserting the tube. Not himself, but through the invisible hand. And not Adam Smith's either. And that a special guardian ad litem shall be appointed to review all the medical records, all the legal records, and report to the governor and the courts about the case. And that became me. And I really didn't know that much about the case at all. Now, the tasks, according to the law, of a guardian ad litem in Florida are to serve the best interests of the ward, Ms. Schiavo. To recognize the principle of substituted judgment, and that is that even if Ms. Schiavo had not proffered a formal living will or a healthcare surrogacy document in which she assigned the explicit privilege and right for someone else to make a decision in the event of her incapacity, that the law provides that there is an ascendancy, a hierarchy of decision-making. Many states have done this. And that the substituted judgment principle of her husband, or ultimately the courts, based on the evidence, rules the day, according to the law. And then there was a formal question. The question was, should the governor lift the stay? And is there feasibility and value in conducting tests, additional swallowing tests, and swallowing therapy? Now, in the law, as some of you may know or may not know, and how many of you have spent time in the state prison? No? Oh. So they're not the audience you told me about, Catherine. Yeah, you may have spent time there in the capacity, but the decision maker in this process has a burden of proof. And in the law, there are three standards of proof. There is, I'm going to start at the bottom, beyond a reasonable doubt. This is usually in criminal cases, where you will hear the defense attorney say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard lots of evidence presented today, but it's your job to determine if that evidence convinces you to the core of your being, beyond any reasonable doubt. If you have a scintilla of doubt, you must. It is your job to find my client not guilty. Beyond a reasonable doubt. That's pretty high standard. But, for somebody being charged with murder or rape or burglary, some crime, you kind of, if you should be unjustly accused, and plenty of people are, you'd want that standard to be pretty high. And then there's this other standard, this preponderance of the evidence. If you have a contract with somebody, or if there's an allegation that somebody poked you in the eye and it's a tort case, all the law wants to know is that the jury is more convinced than not that it probably happened. 51%. But then there's this other ground, this clear and convincing. Now, there are no formulas that we use in the law as we do in biochemistry or in physics. You can't pour things into a beaker and say, clear and convincing. But it has to be beyond the preponderance and less than this. That's the guideline that the judge and the jury have to use. And that is the guideline that's used in determining whether or not the evidence in a case involving a decision to remove somebody from a life support system or from artificial hydration and nutrition shall be made. Now, Governor Bush allowed that convicted felons require this. Ms. Schiavo only required this. It's an emotionally compelling argument. New York requires express written consent. You got to have it in writing. It's extraordinary. That's it. You don't have it in writing, it ain't there. I don't care what people say you said. In Florida, it's substituted judgment, as it is in 17 other states, as being viable clinical standards. And that stuff, when you get right down to it, that judgment, my judgment, Catherine's judgment, your judgment as professionals, gets down to inference and association. That's how we learn and ingest things and make sense of them. We rely on conventional wisdom, which could be what the textbook says today. We also rely extensively, whether we like it or not, on presumption and belief. Can't shake that very easily. And then, of course, there are the political factors that influence us. The environment that we live in. The peer pressures. The threats. The concerns about how others will view us. The express statements about how other people will view us. So these empirical measures are out there. We have science, we have medicine, we have law. But as individuals practicing in the field, those are the drivers that are used to translate, interpret, and apply these on a case-by-case basis. Facts. There are no studies that exist to confirm clinically, in terms of things like a blood test or a bone scan, the fact that somebody is in a persistent vegetative state. I can look at your fracture on a radiogram and say, fractured arm. I can take a blood test and say your blood glucose level is way too high. 220, 230, 250. I can measure those things empirically. I can draw fluid from your spine. And I can measure all kinds of cool things about you. But I don't have that empirical capability with persistent vegetative state. Rather, it's a series of behavioral responsive testing, which are oftentimes augmented with CT scans or MRIs. Now, Professor Burnett at Dartmouth is a neurologist, and he's probably the premier clinician that has dealt with these questions. And he and I've had the great privilege of working with him since this thing started, and we've continued to do some stuff together. And here's what he says: that we can ascertain another's quality and quantity of consciousness only by inference. Only by inference. And that the repertoire of these patients' motor responses to stimuli, while not conclusively excluding the presence of cognitive life, shows no convincing evidence of it. So we're making a judgment call. We're making a judgment call about somebody else's life. Not based on a blood test, and not based on a scan, but based on our intuition, based on our experience, based on what we think the pieces are that fit together. That's pretty extraordinary. But how often do we do that in clinical counseling? Do you sit with a client and have a checklist of things that say your eyes move to the left 3 times, you fidgeted with your right hand twice, that means you fit into this DSM? Maybe yes. We like to think that we rely, not only on the body of clinical evidence that we use as a basis for better understanding a particular client, particular situation, but going beyond that. take the body of stuff that we've become, translating it into that moment, that case, that patient, and making good sense out of it using good science, good medicine, good evidence, and reasoned intuition. Unless we lack that empathic capability, in which case we need those cues, Tom. And that's where they come in handy. But just like medications used to treat certain psychiatric disorders, my son has come to accept that they have value. They have value in taking the edge off, and then you deal with the core issues. Unless somebody truly has a metabolic dysfunction that requires medication to manage it. These surfaced about 8 years ago. They were hidden in a garage. Somebody found them. This is William Blake's. These are some scenes that were drawn for his Divine Comedy. What's happening here is the soul is being brought up. Magnificent set of plates that hadn't been seen forever. And when we make decisions about the lives of other people, we're dealing with their souls. But we're also dealing with our own. And we have to remember that. This is not a technical process. This is not adjusting the horizontal and vertical on the television. This is making decisions or facilitating the making of decisions about the lives of other people, and that affects us each time we do it. We balance interest in this case, which is what a guardian is supposed to do, serving the best interest of the ward, working with the judgment, and then dealing with clinical medicine. Questions of patients' rights, the family, questions about the credibility of the evidence. The credibility of the evidence. I reviewed lots of documents. 30,000 pages of medical and legal records. And this one always struck me as being one of the most profound. This is a CT scan. On your right is Ms. Schiavo's CT scan. Early on in the process. I don't know if you can see this very well. Do any of you know what's going on in here? What? Yeah, this is the cerebral cortex. Why? Why is there no what's missing here? The cerebral cortex is missing. It's gone. It's liquid. 80% of Miss Schiavo's brain substance is gone. This is a normal woman of Miss Schiavo's age. This is what you would normally expect to see in a scan of that size. So you look at this and you say, and by the way, this was a probe that Mr. Schiavo, early on in her therapy, she brought it to California, had an electronic stimulator implanted with the hope that it could regenerate neural activity. It was too late. Way too late, because there was nothing to regenerate. So where do we go? Where do we go if we're genuinely concerned about good science, the good medicine, and the good law, and the application of it through an intuitive process that relies upon the education and training of good folks like you and your students? Upon whom do we rely? I've still got him, for the most part, saying that he'll rely on me. I trust I haven't done anything yet to disabuse you of this. Modeling the expertise. Robert Hammersfar was a neurologist who affixed himself to this case early on. Board-certified neurology, trained at Northwestern University in medicine. Did his residency at the University of Virginia Medical School and hospitals. He early on convinced the parents in this case, Bob and Mary Schindler, that Terry's brain could regrow. We could regrow her brain. Imagine that. What do you think? Now, if somebody off the street said, hey, we can regrow Terry's brain, but here's a board-certified neurologist who has on the head of his stationery that he was nominated for a Nobel Prize. A letter was written by a local congressman to the Nobel Commission saying that he should be nominated for Nobel. They were personal friends. That's not the way the Nobel process works. When Dr. Hamasfar appeared on Hannity and Kong, Sean Hannity said, and this gentleman has been nominated for a Nobel Prize. Said it 7 times in 5 minutes. Another Fox News commentator said he's been awarded the Nobel Prize. Doesn't take long from nomination to award. Senator Bill Frist. Now, let me go back to Dr. Hamasfar because he dealt directly with the family members. And what I'm concerned that he may have contributed to was a false set of expectations. That's putting it mildly. It's building hope where no hope may exist. And once you start feeding that expectation, once you start feeding that hope, it's a powerful thing because hope is one of the most powerful things that we as humans have. Senator Bill Frist, who was a well-respected cardiovascular thoracic surgeon and owner of Humana, which did the bee thing at the time, his family owned it, stands on the floor of the United States Senate. Now, there was a 4-hour videotape made of Ms. Schiavo by her parents, which was directly in contradiction to several court orders. They snuck a video camera in, they took pictures of her, they did things. There was a 3-minute set of snippets that were taken from that, where she turns and she does this. And based on that, Senator Frist says, I have seen the videos of Ms. Schiavo, and I will tell you in my professional clinical opinion, she has conscious awareness. Oh my. That's practicing medicine and creating even more unfounded hope. And then, of course, a few weeks later, he said, I didn't say that. Moron, it's on video. William Cheshire, a board-certified neurologist practicing at the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, made an appearance at the hospice where Ms. Schiavo spent her last days, saw her from a distance, referred to those video clips, and said, I believe she is conscious and aware. I saw all 4 hours of those videos, by the way. And most of it was... But there are clinical characteristics of persistent vegetative state where people do just randomly put their heads up and do things. It's not responsive. It's just part of what she does. She makes random noises. Fred Thompson. Remember Fred Thompson? What show did he star in? There you go. He was also a senator of what state? Tennessee, right? You spent time in Tennessee. We've already established a special connection. Fred Thompson, during this period, was interviewed. Fred Thompson's son was the victim of a serious automobile accident, and he was in a hospice. And he was in a persistent vegetative state. And Fred Thompson got on television at an interview, and he was asked about the Schiavo case at this time. And he said, look, he said, all I'm going to say is these are highly personal matters. These kinds of decisions should and must be made by family members. Keep the press and keep the government out of it. He said, I had to deal with this personally. And I made a very difficult decision about my son. It's one of the most cogent things he ever said, as far as I know. Ron Cranford was the consulting neurologist. Ron was also the consulting neurologist in nearly every major brain death case in this country. Ron and I got to know each other and traded bizarro stories. Ron did intense clinical examinations, as did previous neurologists, and came up unequivocally with the determination that she was in a persistent vegetative state with no reasonable basis. He became one of the expert witnesses on behalf of Mr. Schiavo. And George Greer was the judge in the case. George Greer very conservative Republican, fundamentalist Baptist, was kicked out of his church. Kicked out of his church. Because of his ruling in this case that the evidence and the law and the medicine and the science told him exactly what he had to do. It was clear. So for modeling what expertise really means in terms of the interpretation of the empirical stuff, you've got everything from here to this. Upon whom do we rely? We enter Wonderland. Because that's where we really are. Things seem so strange here. Things are changing so often here. Who's rational? What are the facts? Who's interpreting them and who applies them? Is this her dream? Is it her fantasy? You don't hear much about the dormouse. Ultimately, who's in control of the circumstance? Remember, some of you are way too young. After President Reagan was shot, Alexander Haig was asked, who's in control? He said, I am! No, he wasn't. Wanted to be. It gets kind of confusing. How do we rely on? Oh! Who do we rely on? You choose. Java. You're going to rely on Java? You're going to rely on Johnny Depp in a costume? Or we're going to rely on... Talk about schizophrenia. My God. Who's wearing the costume here? Who's wearing the costume? Clark Kent's wearing the costume. This is what this guy was born with. So who do we rely on? And these are all fantasy creatures anyway. So does it not make a difference? So what are we left with? In this case, we're left with non-empirical standards, no uniformity, subjective assessments. We do have some guidelines. We have some American Academy of Neurology guidelines and Federal Commission guidelines. And we even have guidelines that were created by the American College of Cardinals in the Catholic Church that are not inconsistent with those. And the courts use professional judgment, the credibility of witnesses, the evidence. State law varies. Like New York says it ain't signed, we don't do it. In Florida we say we'll use substitute judgment. But the evidence that comes to court when there are these disputes has to be articulated in some form that meets these standards. So after I got appointed, I had to figure out where to go. Where do I start? And I met the family. I spent lots of time with them establishing trust, which is not easy to do. I'm parachuting in from 30,000 feet, and I have to deal with people I don't know concerning someone I don't know about whom they're passionately involved. Passionately. And diametrically opposed. Boy, do they not like each other. There were 30,000 documents. Most of them had this heading on them. They were court documents. If they weren't court documents, they were medical records. I had the fabulous advantage of being at a major university health sciences center. So I could draw upon the clinical expertise around me. I had to relearn my physiology and anatomy. I had to really try to learn neurophysiology. I had my colleagues around the country in all the disciplines, and I made a point of making sure that within each discipline I consulted somebody who was an ethicist in their discipline, whether it was social work or medicine, law or psychology. I interviewed members of the clergy representing every denomination because part of what I had to do was get inside of this, better understand it, as objectively as I could, because I've been trained, as you heard from my bizarre background, across philosophy and history and science and business and law. So I'm trying to take these tidbits I have no deep and narrow. I've got a wide and shallow. But I try to pick up a little bit of the good earth as I go. And I rely upon the kindness of strangers and friends who've been very good to me. Tennessee Williams. Always cite your sources. So I went back to some of my old friends as I'm reading these documents, and I had to go back to basics. I had to go back to the places where I spent early days thinking and being taught and learning. And one of the first people I went to was a guy who was a locker mate in high school, Dante. Remember him? The Inferno. Written, emblazed in a plaque on the gates of hell, as Virgil is escorting Dante through the multiple layers of this underworld, is a sign that says, "Lasciate ogni speranza voci entrate." Eh? Yes? How many of you speak Bulgarian? What does this mean? Lasciate ogni speranza voci entrate. Eh? Hoo-ha? Huh? Let it go. Yo. Give up. Let go. Abandon. Abandon hope. All hope. Those who enter here. All you who enter here. Can you imagine what it means to abandon all hope? How would you know it if you did? If you gave up all hope, what is hope? What is hope? It's this expectation, this ability to be aware of something beyond yourself, out here. Abandon the capacity to even know that there is anything else. Abandon consciousness, awareness. So that helped me get started. By the way, does anybody remember what the inner circle of Dante's ninth hell has in it? Who goes to the worst, the deepest, the darkest, the worst place you can go in hell? Remember? Those who betray benefactors. Remember that. I went to Renee. Renee and I met in college. We met in high school, but we really met in college. And Renee admonished me, cogito ergo sum, which means what? Translate. Go back. Those of you who learned Latin, and there's still some of you in the room, what does that mean? Now, that's how we've done. But let's go back to the roots. Cogito is really, we've now used it as cognition. I'm cognating. Cognating is the thinking process. Therefore, I am. I am what? I'm cognizant. It's an enhanced level of awareness. It's not just having the sense of something beyond me. It's having a cognizance of what it might be. It's an awareness. And it suggests a process, a continuum, not just a state of being. So I jump ahead to a guy I spent entirely too much time with in college and graduate school. Frederick. Frederick was a difficult man. Reading him in German is impossible. Reading him in English is worse. But Nietzsche says, "Wochen ist Gott, rief ich will euch sagen, wir haben eingedacht. Ihr und ich, wir alle sind sein Mörder." What? What does it say? Where is God? I'll tell you, he said. We've killed him. We've killed God. You and me. Ihr und ich. We're all his murderer! Now, this is the basis upon which Nietzsche has been convicted of saying God is dead. You've heard that. It's not quite what he meant. What Nietzsche suggests is that in a post-industrial society, as individuals live in more complex environments, we are encouraged and we eventually gladly abdicate personal responsibility. Now, what Nietzsche is big on is the power of the will. Nietzsche allows that the fundamental, essential component of human existence is the capacity to will, to manifest, to cause, to become. It is not a static state. It's at best a gerund. It's becoming. And that defines, and that power of the will is a divine phenomenon. It was the spirit, it was the light that the divine entity created within each of us. It allows us to have free will. It allows us to manifest as opposed to just hope and wish. It's intentionality. Now, Hitler brought it to an entirely different extreme that he predicted would happen, but he was dead by then. So, if we have this concept of hope, which is something beyond ourselves, and the principle of cognition, which is this more conscious awareness and interactivity, and then you have the power of the will to take that and make things of it, to manifest, to create, to become. That's pretty cool. Now, all of that underlies, clinically, what we talk about when we're talking about consciousness and awareness. Did Theresa Schiavo have the capacity to be conscious and aware, let alone to manifest? Now, what do we know? What do we know about the science? You know, we know things about what the cerebral cortex does. What a mustache she had, huh? Look at that thing. Imagine pizza got caught in it all the time. You had leftovers for weeks. But there's the final quote, and that's Brother Theodore. Now, he used to appear on television back in the 60s and early 70s. This is the kind of thing you'd ordinarily suspect Lenny Bruce of saying, because they were about the same time. The best thing is never to have been born, but who among us is that lucky? Yeah, it's like, imagine not being. Talk about a depressive, huh? Whew. Let me share with you some of the faces, the lives, clinical practice, and ultimately some policies in the next few minutes. And then maybe we can interface a bit more. That is someone that most of you have not seen. That's a picture of Theresa Schiavo when she was 16 years old. She weighed 250 pounds. And her father never let her forget that she was a big fat girl. Lots of chiding from family. At 17 years of age, she turned to her mother and said, I've had enough of this, I've got to lose weight. They went to a physician, they went on a diet, and within a few years she began losing weight. She got down, ultimately, after marrying Michael, to 110 pounds. Huge, huge change. One of her proudest moments was when she put on a bikini for the first time in her life. Pretty girl. Oh, look at that. That's somebody else I kind of want you to think about. I'm going to introduce you to somebody. This is Exter, E-X-T-E-R. Exter is my cockatiel. Exter is sitting on the dining room table after a Passover dinner, where he frequently spent his time after we were done, of course. He was very attentive and thoughtful. Exter had an extraordinary personality. Little bird. Any of you ever have birds? I mean, they're really people underestimate. They may have smaller brains, but they use more of them than we use of ours. He also had an extraordinary repertoire. Sings, He did freeform jazz. He did Vivaldi, beautiful Vivaldi and some Mozart. Taught him everything I know. I want you to remember Exter. Exter had an accident. I don't know if you can see very clearly because of the lighting, but right up here, you can't see it very well there, but we moved into another house, and we had these fans, and he was disoriented, and he hit a fan and got whacked across the room, and he was very badly injured. And brought him to the vet, and they said, this is really bad. Now, by this time, Exter's a member of our family. It's a $49 cockatiel. But still, this was $2,400 later. Exter's wing is amputated. So Exter can no longer fly, and it took a couple of months for him to heal. But he did fine. Reestablished himself, started singing again, took over the house from the floor. One of the most popular pictures transmitted all over the world of Theresa Schiavo. And I can tell you from what I learned about her that she was an exceptionally modest woman. This is the last thing she would have wanted, next to her parents fighting with her husband. She would have been so embarrassed, so sad. I go by the rules, looking for clear and convincing evidence, looking at what we know about diagnostics, prognostics, wishing versus wanting, taking the politics and some of the other stuff out of it, looking at the science, the underlying science that we know in terms of cerebral functioning. What can we do with stem cells and implants? Nothing yet. What do we know about swallowing and breathing? What do we know about all the technical, clinical, underlying factors that are associated with her condition as we can measure it? And then we take those things because there's a dispute among the parties, and when there's a dispute that we can't resolve, we take it to court. And when we go to court, we rely upon the law, and we rely upon laws of guardianship, evidence, and civil procedure. And we've put those things together. But we still have to deal with the reality of the people. That's Mrs. Schindler, Mary Schindler, who is Terry's mother. Imagine being a parent and being told that there's no hope for your child. That's not supposed to happen. That's not the way it's scripted. We're supposed to predecease our children. And to be told that it's hopeless, that there's nothing you can do. And then to be told by others, we can do something for you. We can regrow her brain. She'll be eating a ham sandwich in 2 years. Somebody told her that. A physician. You can see the grief. This is the day she died. What do you do? Where do you go with this? This is one of the photos that was supposed to evidence awareness, consciousness. Reaching out. Help me. It's compelling. I spent a lot of time with her. I would go into her room, sometimes for 4 hours at a time. I would close the door behind me, and I would grab her head, and I would shake it. I would talk to her, I would yell at her, I would sing to her, I would play music to her, I would do anything I could to elicit a response. Almost anything I could. And there was no consistent responsiveness. There were lots of reactions. There were lots of random reactions that were caught on those tapes. And I kept on saying, help me, help you. I didn't know this person. I was trying to get to know her through people who did know her and through the record that existed. And I was being asked to review all that clinical and legal stuff and then tell the courts and the governor something about where they should go. We kind of do that every day when we're practicing. We affect people's lives. But this was bizarre. Another widely publicized photograph of Mrs. Schindler interacting with her daughter. Michael Saylor and his wife. How do you balance these things out against the clinical facts? Where do you go with them? How do you go with them? Again, which laws and what science? In terms of basic clinical ethics, what do we do with personal autonomy? Whose personal autonomy? Ms. Schiavo's? Or, as I came to say, it's not about the governor, it's not about her parents, it's not about her husband, it's not about the lawyers, it's not about the court, it's about her. But who's standing in for her? Substituted judgment? The guardians, her fathers, her husbands, the courts, mine, Jeb Bush's, the rights of society, interested parties. We have an interest in this because there's a slippery slope that gets created. You unplug her, we unplug everybody, and then we start putting people down. You look like you have a little disability, you're gone. What is an independent judiciary? I believe as a consequence of this case, it was the court system more than anything else that maintained the integrity of our laws. Judge Greer put his life at stake because he had a fatwa out on him. $1 million award for his death. Now, there's something I didn't tell you, going back to this. And that is, Extra grew up in our house with my sons. They were very young when we first got them. And we have sometimes bizarre discussions around the dinner table. We talk about all kinds of weird stuff. And a recurring theme, you can't imagine that, can you? A recurring theme shortly after we got Exter was I would point to Exter and I'd say to my sons, what if all of this is Exter's dream? And one of these days, Exter's going to wake up and we're just going to evaporate. Gone. And we talk about that. It was a nice point of departure for relativity. Consciousness. Perception. Reality. What I want for dinner. Whatever it was kind of a fun springboard. So the rule in Exter's case, partly, is whose dream? Now, I don't watch television, but I remember this very clearly. It was back in 1988, and my sons watched television. And they asked me to come in from my office, and they said, you got to see this. It's the last episode of St. Elsewhere. Did you ever see that? And I heard about it. It was about a hospital, and it was this, and people's lives, the usual thing where they do multiple tales of things. And the last episode is very interesting. After they sell the hospital to the big bad private corporation, and everybody's kind of going their own way, the chief of staff, the medical director, the director of nursing, the administrator of the hospital, they're all well-known characters. All well-known characters. It's a snowy day, and they're going their own way, and the camera pans out. It's the last episode. The camera's panning out from the room that they're in, and it comes outside of the hospital, and you see the brownstone bricks of the hospital, and it's snowing out. And you're hearing the remnants of the conversation there, and as it's panning further and further away, all of a sudden there's a shift in the conversation. And you hear a different decibel level and a different voice saying, come on, son, it's time to wash your hands, it's time for dinner. And it's repeated several times, and it's pulled further and further out until you see a set of hands. And the hands are holding one of those little snowballs, those things that you shake, and they have snow, And inside the snowball is this little brown building. And there's this kid holding the snowball. And the father is saying, come on, son, it's time to wash your hands. It's time for dinner. And they pan out, and now you're transported from the hospital scene into this place, and it's a working class apartment somewhere in Boston or upstate New York, who knows. And it's a modestly furnished place, and people are wearing modest working clothes, but they're the same characters that had been the chief of staff, the director of nursing, the president of the hospital, except they're not. They're one of them's his uncle, the other one's his sister, father or sister or brother or something. They're family members. And this autistic child is holding this globe, and all of a sudden you realize that there's a very different thing going on here. And they say, what does he see in that? He stares at it all the time. He focuses on that, and he lives through that thing. And I said, ooh, that's pretty cool. That means this whole thing was like his fantasy. I said, that's neat. And then I start dealing with Terry, in this case. And the concern I have was, is there some level of awareness that she has that I can't reach, that I can't touch? Because I'm pretty good at doing that. And maybe there's something that I'm missing. My mother, at age 96, tripped on the 4th of July, broke her hip while dancing. And then 3 years later, went through the classic decline through dementia, died at 99, 5 months before her 100th birthday. And about the last 18 months, she'd had these incredibly vivid things going on. She would have discussions with people. They were right there. And I'd say, she's really having this. And I, take us back to Extra's dream. Who am I to say what the reality is? Maybe the reality, we talk about madness in civilization. Maybe it's the psychotic, schizophrenic, wild person who sees the real stuff. We've been programmed, and we've accepted the programming to see something else. That's why you trust me. Still? More so, perhaps. So I was concerned about this. Is there anything left? The day that Miss Schiavo died, I was in the courtyard of the Capitol in Tallahassee, and there was obviously it was an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. You can't miss him. With the black coat and the hat and the whole shtick, and he had a big pile of clothing next to him. So I walked up to him and I said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "Yes. I've come to find the governor and the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate. I have to speak with them. I've come down from New York." I said, "What?" He said, "I've come to save Theresa Schiavo." Interesting, I should meet you. We talked a little bit, and he said something that was extraordinary, but actually not. He said, the scintilla of hope creates hope for all things. It's that spark, that divine spark of possibility, of the potential to be aware that can grow into the flame of cognition and the wonderful tidal wave of becoming. Conscious, intentional awareness. Don't extinguish it. What do you do with that? This is Miss Schiavo's tombstone. She was cremated within days of her death, contrary to the wishes of her parents. Michael put on the bottom of it, "I kept my promise," which he alleged was to allow her to die in peace. I believe him. I came to know all these players really well. And then there's Exter, with whom I'll close. Exter lost his wing, as I told you, and he was on the floor. And he'd gone through trauma. This was a really traumatic experience, having the wing cut off, major surgery. And I presumed that, cockatiels live about 25 years, more or less. I presumed that Exter might not live all that time because of his trauma, and that he would, succumb to an infection or disease, or somebody would step on him. Oh man. He was in a place he never was. He was in another room. And I was walking out, and I stepped, and I heard this loud squeak, and I thought it was like a toy, a dog toy, because my wife had recently gotten a pit bull as a family pet. A pit bull that had been traumatized as an infant. I've been divorced since May 11th. But the pit bull was afraid of the bird. The bird would raise its one wing and back the dog into a corner. It was the darndest thing. I stepped and I realized what I did. My middle son, Mark, who also had a relationship with Exter, we all did, but Mark and I had special relationship. I pick up Exter. I call Mark. I said, we're taking Exter to the vet right now. I'm holding Exter in my hands. We're driving to the vet. Within 3 minutes, Exter dies in my hands. His heart stops, respiration stops. There was nothing I could do. And I turned to Mark and I said, he's dead. My son, who at the time was probably 16, first words out of his mouth, I guess this isn't Dexter's dream. We were still here. Unless it still was. Remember this? Life is but a dream. Row, row, row your boat. You learned that as a child. And if it is, whose dream? And to what extent, if it's even your dream, can you intentionalize within it? Can you manifest? Can you become and help others manifest while you're doing it? That kind of goes to the core of what we're trying to do as professionals in our disciplines. To affect the lives of other people in ways that make it better for all of us. In Superman 3, after Lex Luthor and his bad guy companion almost destroy the world, Superman rounds them up, brings them back, and deposits them in the courtyard of the prison. And as he's flying off, the warden says, Superman, how can we ever thank you? Superman says, there's no need to thank me, warden. We're all in this together. Now, being all in it together, balancing against my acute selfishness, is an interesting challenge. Being all in this together and getting beyond the technocracy that we are allowing to play our lives out through is another challenge. But it's your challenge individually. Each one of you, every day, every moment. It takes a lot of energy. And this is no different from any other sermon you might hear. Anywhere you go, ooh, that sounds pretty cool. And then let it die down. But that's your decision. The opportunities that you have to consciously, positively, and meaningfully affect not only the lives of others around you through your professional and personal stuff, but your own life are constant. And it really is all up to you. The bottom line of my report, the last line of my report, is sometimes good law is not enough. Good medicine is not enough. And all too often, good intentions don't suffice. Sometimes the answer is in the process, not the presumed outcome. And we have to be left with the hope that the right thing will be done well. And that's what you are left with. That you will do the right thing well in all that you do. That's all, folks.